Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Amateur Radio General Class, session number 12. I'd like to take the opportunity to wish everyone Happy New Year. Okay, so during our previous session, we discussed what was 2.4 gigahertz, also dealt with mesh networks. Then we also discussed digital voice, DMR, D-Star, system fusion. We talked about characteristic impedance. What is coaxial cable? We talked about mismatch and reflection. We also dealt with SWR, or standing wave ratio. We talked about matching networks and antenna tuners, also transmission line loss and in relation to length, frequency, and SWR. We also discussed parallel line transmission lines, half-wave dipoles, feed point impedance, and we ended the technical topics discussing ground reflection losses. So the agenda for this evening, we will be discussing quite a number of antenna-related topics, such as the quarter wave ground plane. We'll talk about what ground mountain radials are. Also, we'll discuss feed point impedance, what the random wire antenna is. We'll also get into some directional antennas. We'll talk about the concepts of antenna gain and reference dBi and dBd, as well as what is front to back ratio. We'll discuss the antenna known as the Yagi. We'll talk about the concept of stacking. Then we'll talk about some matching networks such as the gamma match and hairpin match, sometimes called the beta match. Then some more antennas again. We'll talk about the inverted V, the log periodic concept antenna called NVIS, and we'll also discuss a bit about the beverage antenna. And then we go into talking about harmonic rejection as it relates to multiband antennas. And also we'll discuss traps, what they are, how they're applied, and also some other antennas such as the end-fed half-wave, sometimes called the ZEP, and also the magnetic loop antenna, the screwdriver antenna, and then we'll end the technical topics discussing the halo antenna. Of course, we will do our usual question pool review that covers all of the topics that we would have dealt with during this evening's session. Okay, so we still do have quite a few people that's encountering the course on YouTube as well as some other streaming platforms, and we're getting a lot of questions. So just to be clear, this particular course that you're viewing right now is the level 2 course, or what we call the general class level in the FCC system. So there's a previous level called the technician class level, and on your screen are the links to take that course. It's available on demand, and you can have a look at it at your own leisure and time. And there's also a link for all of the handouts, including the text for that course level, right? So that's the first level, the technician class course. But we are currently doing the general class, or the level 2. So speaking of which, this is where we are with respect to our curriculum. So we are progressing quite nicely. I would say we are just about the halfway point of the course material, just about, give or take. So we just have a few more topics to go to finish our syllabus. Just a reminder again, we'll always be advocating that participants, it's never too early to consider taking the practice exams. And on your screen are the links, the URLs to be able to generate practice exams and take them. So if you're passing them, you know you're ready for the real exam, because the practice exams are based on exactly the same question pool as your live exam or the real exam will be. Okay, this is just a running slide on Zello, interacting with the organization, React. Okay, so in respect of this course that we're undertaking right now, the general class level, or level 2, on your screen are 2 links of importance to students. First of all, first link is where you can get all of the documents, all of the handouts that we have provided, as well as all of the slide packs for every single session. They're there for you to use, and of course, as you see fit, feel free to share it with persons. This information can be shared. Also, we have a recording portfolio of all of the sessions that we have had thus far, right? So once we're able to successfully record the sessions, we will place them there. For a couple of reasons, not everyone is able to make the time that we're having these live sessions on a Friday at 8:30 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time. Also, if you join late for some reason, work matters, family matters, you won't miss out because you'll have the recording, or just simply to review. Maybe you attended the session but would like to go over something, maybe play and stop a little slower than we might actually run it in the live class. You can do so using these links that will give you the playlist of all of the videos. So please make use of this, and of course you can feel free to share this information with anyone that you think would be interested. Okay, so there's an accompanying text to this level that we're using. We're using the No Nonsense General Class License Study Guide, and of course there are several other good texts from the ARL, for example, as well as Gordon West, produce materials, study guides for the the entire range of courses. You have the technician, you have the general, which is what we're doing, and the extra class. Highly recommended that you consider supporting the authors on acquiring at least one text, a couple if you can, but it's optional really. You do not need to purchase anything. What we do in this live course, it's sufficient for you to be able to gather all of the knowledge necessary to be able to successfully take the exam. So there's no obligation, but again, we do highly recommend, right? You avail yourself of at least one of the texts. The one we're using is this one that's highlighted in yellow. Okay, so we had a question from the last session, and I think it might have been Charlie who would have asked the question. And the question was, why do we say the SWR was 5-1 and not 1-5, right? And that's a very relevant question because we dealt with two examples of SWR calculation. And you would have detected in the second one that we did in fact reverse the order to make sure that the answer was greater than 1. So we just have a bit of information on your screen. You could read it in your own time. But essentially, it is conventional for us to state the SWR as a number greater than 1. So 5-1. It will not be 1-5, right? 5-1. And that is simply because it's really the ratios of the voltage or standing waves, right? The VSWR. And it's always the maximum divided by the minimum. So once you have that, there'll always be a greater than 1 result, right? So just note when you're doing SWR calculations, it's always a number larger than 1, 5-1. So it will not be 1-5. So excellent question there, Charlie. And glad you spotted it as well. Keen eyes indeed, and it's a good teaching point as well. So it's always that how we do the calculation. We've just repeated this slide here. So you can see, for example, the two questions, it's 50 ohms, 200, and notice that we put the 200 first and then the 50 afterwards. Notice the other one where it's 50 ohms and 10 ohms, we still put the 50 first and then the 10 after. So the larger number first, the smaller number after, and that's just because we are using the larger voltage divided by the smaller voltage. That's what we do. So it will always be a number that's equal to or greater than 1. So 4-1, 5-1, that sort of thing, right? Excellent question. All right, so let's move on to the technical topics. We have quite a bit to cover this evening, and we may go just a little bit over. So crave your indulgence. All right, so we've been dealing with different types of antennas. We are in the section called antennas and feed lines. So some more antenna types. We dealt with things like dipole. So we have also to deal with several other types of antennas. As an amateur radio operator, you need to be familiar with the different designs of antennas, the different properties, what they look like, why we construct them the way that way in terms of the lengths, as well as what we will do with some of the other elements of the antenna construction itself. You need to be quite familiar. So we'll be going through them. So up next is the quarter wave ground plane vertical antenna, right? So sometimes just simply called the quarter wave ground plane or just the quarter wave. But what is quarter wave in this antenna? So if you were to look, there's a diagrammatic representation of the antenna. Notice there's one element here. We call it the driven element or the radiating element. That element will be quarter wavelength long. So that's why we have lambda over 4. That simply means quarter wavelength. So we'll show the calculation in a short while. You may recall we had a formula for the half wavelength. So similarly, we have a formula for the quarter wavelength. And if you're already thinking, but wait a minute, if you had a formula for the half wavelength, will the quarter wavelength formula be half of that? Yes, you'll be quite correct, right? So you'll see that in a little bit. So quarter wavelength, the element will be quarter wave long. Quarter wave what? Well, whatever the frequency of operation, whatever frequency you're using, that wavelength, it's quarter. So essentially antennas match the frequency that is being used, right? So if you're in the UHF band, the antenna will be much shorter. If you're in the VHF band, it will be a bit longer. And if you're in the HF band, it will be a pretty long antenna, right? So relatively speaking, that is. So antennas are constructed based and directly proportional to the frequency, because we did show previously that frequency and wavelength are inversely proportional, right? So the higher the frequency, the smaller the wavelength. The lower the frequency, the longer, the larger the wavelength, right? So therefore, the antennas will also follow a similar pattern. So that's why we say, in terms of the antenna, it's quarter wavelength of the frequency that you're constructing the antenna for. So this quarter wave antenna, you have the radiating element here, and then you have what are called radials, right? Yeah, the radials here. And these radials will also be cut to the length of quarter wavelength of whatever frequency this antenna has been constructed for, right? And you'll see the formula. We'll do an example in a short while to make it real. But we also have some radiation patterns, and we need to know that this quarter wave ground plane vertical antenna, why quarter wave? Because it's quarter wavelength long. Ground plane vertical, it's a vertical antenna as opposed to being horizontal or some other form of polarization, right? And it's quarter wavelength. That's why it's called a quarter wave antenna. And we need to be aware for this quarter wavelength antenna that the radiation pattern of the antenna is 360 degrees all around, or what we say, it's omnidirectional, or the azimuth. Right? Remember we said azimuth is all around and elevation was up, down. So if we were to look here, we are actually looking at this antenna. We are looking at it from the top. We're looking down into the antenna. You'll notice that the radiation pattern is 360 degrees all around, right? Or what we call omnidirectional. So this antenna will radiate the energy, the radio signals in all directions like this. So this is the radiation pattern when you look down. But if you look at a side view of the antenna, so you're looking at it from the side, you'll notice that it has lobes this way, right? So just to give you an idea of the diagrams to show you the radiation pattern of the signal, the radio frequency signal that's leaving the antenna. When you have your transceiver, your radio transmitter, you're speaking to it, or you use a digital mode and you have your computer that's connected to the transceiver and it's transmitting via the feed line to the antenna. And then wirelessly, you have the radio frequency that's leaving. It has properties such as the angle of radiation, as well as whether it's all around, up, down, you know. So we need to be familiar with the quarter wave, and we also just mentioned some extra information here that a quarter wavelength antenna has a low angle of radiation. What do we mean by low angle of radiation as opposed to a high angle of radiation? So low angle of radiation is sort of like this way, right? This is the antenna. A higher angle of radiation will be this way. And when we come to talking about some other concepts such as NVIS, you'll see where we employ high angles of radiation to our purpose, right? So as amateur radio operators, as discerning hams, we need to understand these properties so that we can select the appropriate antenna for the purpose. And that's why we learn all of this theory. Okay, so sticking with the quarter wavelength antenna, we did promise a formula. So here's our trusty formula for quarter wave. And if you're saying, but wait a minute, that is exactly, half of what we learned the last time, 468 over frequency, it's 234. You'd be quite right, because 468 is the formula for the half wave dipole. But the quarter wave is actually going to be half of that. So it's L, which is the length of the antenna, is equal to 234 divided by F. And F is the frequency in question in megahertz. So whatever frequency you're constructing or cutting this antenna for is what that frequency will be. So this is the formula to calculate the length of a quarter wave antenna. So that's the radiating element will be quarter wavelength long, as well as the radials will also be quarter wavelength long. So this is how you calculate it, and you can construct your own antenna quite simply. So let's do a worked example, and this is actually a question in the exam. What is the approximate length of a quarter wave monopole antenna cut for 28.5 megahertz? Let's dissect this question. What are they asking us? What is the approximate length for an antenna? So they want us to calculate the length of the antenna. That's what we need to get. And we will get the answer in feet. So the answer will be something feet, right? So they're asking us for the length of the antenna. But what type of antenna? Quarter wave. So we already know we need to use the formula for the quarter wavelength antenna. L is equal to 234 divided by F, which is frequency. And They give us the frequency. Yes, they did. Frequency is 28.5 megahertz. That's a frequency in the HF spectrum, right? So remember, at the end of the slide deck, we'll be reproducing that trusty table that shows what is HF, what is VHF, what is UHF, the frequency ranges. So this is in the HF spectrum, 28.5 megahertz. Can we calculate what a quarter wavelength antenna will be for this frequency? Yes, certainly we can, because we know our trusty quarter wavelength formula. What we do is we are trying to calculate L for the length. We have the 234 that's given, and then we substitute in the denominator F. But what is F? F is frequency. They gave it to us, it's 28.5. So that's how we come to this next equation. We substitute into F 28.5, and that's what we do here. And when we use our calculator and divide these two, we will get approximately 8 feet. And we encourage you to pull out your calculator or whatever and just run this calculation to convince yourself that this is the right answer. So for 28.5 megahertz frequency, if you're operating as an amateur radio operator on that frequency, your antenna, for it to be resonant in a quarter wavelength design, it will be 8 feet long, right? That's what it means. Sticking with the quarter wave antenna, what if we mount that antenna on the ground? So you have the ground here, all that's grass, and you have the dirt below, and you have the sky here. And this is the quarter wave antenna, and these are the radials. Can you do that? Certainly you can, especially for HF. It's typical that you can have a vertical antenna mounted on the ground like this. And there's some things for the exam that we need to be aware of, that these radials, and notice we have many radials, and the more radials you have, the better. So we showed in the previous diagram that, you had 4 radials, but there are many radials here in this example you have, but each of them will be quarter wavelength long or so. This element here will be quarter wavelength. And quarter wavelength of what? Well, what of the frequency? Remember the last question, we are operating on 28.5 megahertz. So it will be that quarter of that wavelength, right? So we need to be aware that the radials, in this case, if we are ground mounting a quarter wave antenna, the radials need to be either on the ground, or as we see on the surface of the earth, or buried in the dirt, but just a couple of inches, not too much, not too deep, just a couple of inches, right? Because if you put it too deep, then you may have ground losses that will affect your radio signal, right? So you don't want to put it too deep in, either just directly on the surface of the earth like this here, or you can go just a couple of inches below if you need to bury it, but not too far. These are exam questions. All right, so we're sticking with the quarter wavelength antenna. And you may recall previously we had discussed that each antenna, the feed point, has an impedance. And that's actually what we're trying to do, Hamza matchmakers. And we're trying to match the feed point impedance of an antenna, whatever that is, to the impedance of the transmission line, and also to match the impedance of the transmitter RF output stage, right? So we're trying to have a nice match. You may recall that match in amateur radio we are trying to achieve is 50 ohms. That's 50 ohms. So the transmission line, let's say this coaxial cable is 50 ohms. The transmitter or the transceiver radio frequency output stage is also expecting a 50 ohm match. But the antenna itself may not be 50 ohms. When we construct it, it may be something other than 50 ohms. It might be less. And as a matter of fact, for the standard quarter wave antenna, when we construct them and we lay it out just like this, the feed point impedance is actually not 50 ohms. It's around maybe 35 ohms. So what we need to do is increase that impedance. And one way for a ground plane, and this is typical, especially in the VHF and even UHF bands, one way to increase that impedance, you see these radials here, they are just at 90 degrees to the main element. Well, what we can do, we can angle them down a bit. Notice how they are tilted this way here or sloped downwards. Well, just the fact of that sloping, it affects the capacitance and it causes the impedance to change. So when you do this bending or this sloping of the radials, you actually bring the feed point impedance of this antenna closer to 50 ohms. And that's why you'll see some ground plane antennas having the radials sloped like this, sometimes like at a 45-degree angle, for example, right? And that's the point here of this bullet point, and it's an exam question, right? So slope downwards to increase the impedance to match the 50 ohms, which is what your feed line wants and your radio wants. Once you do that, Hamza Matchmaker matchmakers, everybody will be quite happy. Your radio, your feed line, and your antenna, and you by extension, and the other amateur radio operator that you're communicating with will be that much happier because you're transferring maximally. Your signal is getting out from your antenna into free space to the next antenna and vice versa. That's what you're trying to achieve. And you need to have a pretty good match. Hams are matchmakers. Okay, so just to mention, there's a type of antenna called a random wire antenna. So just a bit of extra information here for you, what it looks like. It's just a random length of wire. You have to tune it, so you have to put an antenna tuner so that you can tune it for the frequency that you want to use. And what we need to know is that a random wire antenna like this can in fact be it can cause stray radio frequency to be present inside of your shack or inside of your radio room, right? So you have to be very, very, very careful with these random wire antennas, right? So in a way, as an amateur radio operator, safety first, as we would have alluded to. You need to be quite safe. So inside of your house, you have to be mindful that bringing that random wire antenna may cause that radio frequency to be present and around. And that's where things like grounding and making sure that you do a proper installation helps, right? So just bear that in mind. If this is a very long wire, maybe it's 100 feet long for HF, and you have your antenna tuner, it will tune it. You may have that stray RF or RF current that is inside of your house or your shack. So this is the roof of your house and this is the wall. So inside of here, there may be that present, and that could be potentially a danger or a hazard. So you need to be mindful of that as an amateur radio operator. All right, so we have been talking about antennas that will, when you transmit into them, will send the signal 360 degrees, what we call omnidirectional, all directions more or less equally, not exactly, but more or less. It will send the signal all over. But sometimes you don't want to do that. Sometimes you want to have it a little more directive. So for example, a flashlight, if you think about it, and we have a slide coming up in a little bit, it'll show you that. Sometimes you want a flashlight to focus all of the light in one direction. Well, that's exactly what we're doing with antennas as well. We are focusing a lot of the radio frequency signal in a particular direction. So we also have directional antennas. Again, just like a flashlight, you can have a bulb, let's say on the roof of your the ceiling, for example, and it's emanating light in all directions. But you may want to spotlight something in a corner, and therefore you have a flashlight or a light that has a focus. So we do that with antennas as well, and they're called directional antennas. So antennas that do 360, they are normally called omnidirectional, or 360 degrees in azimuth, right? They transmit, and the radiation pattern is all around, all directions, right? 360. But with the directional antenna, we are trying to focus that signal into a particular direction. So you will see that when we talk about directional antennas. And directional antennas will focus this transmit signal in that particular direction. It will be strong, it will be very weak in the other areas, other directions, but also it will receive strongly in that same direction as well, right? So there's that reciprocity where you transmit strongly, you will also receive strongly in that same direction, generally speaking, right? So that directivity that we speak about is for both transmit and receive. Now, one of the things that as amateur radio operators, apart from using less power to transmit, which is a concept in amateur radio, you use the least amount of power that you need to get your message or signal across. But here's the thing about when you do that, you want to make sure that your signal goes in a particular direction. But sometimes the reason you do it is because there's interference around. So you don't want to listen to interference that's behind you or to the left-hand side of you or to the right-hand side of you. So you use antennas like these that are directional, and you turn them, and notice below you might have something like a rotor or what we call a rotator. And that may turn the antenna in the direction that you need it to be, because other directions will not be as sensitive, and therefore you could actually get rid of some interference or interfering signals by using directional antennas. So it starts to sort of ignore the interference that may be coming from a particular direction. You just point the antenna away from that interference. So that's one of the reasons that you may use a directional antenna, apart from just getting a stronger signal into a particular direction or being able to receive more sensitively in a particular direction. You may wish to reject interfering signals by using the properties of a directional antenna and point it away from the interfering signals. And of course, here on your screen, we have two examples of what directional antennas might look like. This one is called a Yagi, this one is called a quad. Right, so highly directional antennas. All right, so more on that in a little bit. Right, so because the antennas are directional, notice here we had talked a bit about omnidirectional antenna, where the signal goes out in all directions, just like a light bulb like this, right? Equally in all directions, omnidirectional. However, antennas can be made to be directional, just like this flashlight. And when we do that, and we focus and concentrate all of the signal, or most of the signal, in a particular direction, we say that we have something called gain, because the signal is, in a way, it seems to be stronger or amplified in a particular direction. We're taking the same signal, but instead of wasting it where we don't need it to go, we are focusing it just like a flashlight. That's what we do with the radio frequency as an amateur radio operator. So when we talk about such gain, it's measured in, guess what, units? We talked about it already. It's called the decibel, or dB. Now, when we talk about gain, for antennas, we need to be aware of two types of gain. And as a matter of fact, sometimes one is used to sort of over-advertise a particular antenna. You know, sometimes when you have ads for things, people like to overstate things a little bit. They're not quite wrong, but you need to be aware of this little trick sometimes that antenna manufacturers use to dupe you a little bit into thinking that you're getting something more than you're paying for, right? So we need to be aware that the gain of an antenna, right? So the antenna itself is sending all of the signal in a particular, most of the signal in a particular direction. Therefore, we have gain. And the gain is expressed in terms of decibels. You may remember that from the technician level, and we also dealt with it quite a bit already in the general class level, the decibel. But for antennas, we can give that gain, right? If we say twice times whatever dBs, or 3 times or 4 times, you know, and we give it in decibels, we can give a decibel in reference to something. So remember when we were doing dBs, we said, you know, it's the base 10. But when we are doing the antenna gain, gain is in reference to some baseline. So you can baseline your gain to a dipole. So you have a standard antenna that's called a dipole. And if you have an antenna that has gain, how much gain is it ahead of a dipole or more than a dipole? So all things being equal, and you can give it in terms of that gain with respect to the dipole, and we call that dBd, and that last D is dipole. So decibel gain reference to a dipole antenna. But you can also give the same gain that the antenna has. Nothing has changed. You can also give it with respect to the isotropic radiator. Now, what is the isotropic? The isotropic is an ideal antenna. It will definitely send signals out in a 3-dimensional fashion, 360 degrees right through. It's like a spherical transmission. Now, no antenna is actually ideal as that, but theoretically, we talk about the isotropic antenna. It's not a real antenna. It's probably almost impossible to create a real isotropic antenna, but for conceptual purposes, we come close to it and we talk about it as the isotropic antenna, as opposed to the, let's say, the dipole standard. We use the isotropic standard. And when we use gain, or we describe gain reference to the baseline of an isotropic, we say dBi. So dBd for the decibel gain reference to a dipole, and dBi when we're talking about an antenna gain reference to the isotropic. Now, here's the thing. You can give either or both. And some antenna manufacturers will give one versus the other. Sometimes they give the dBi. The reason is dBi will be greater than dBd. Always is, actually by 2.15 decibels, right? So, you know, they say, well, why don't we kind of overstate our gain by just saying dBi and leave out the dBd? So instead of saying the antenna is 4 dB. D, they will tell you it's 6.15 dBi. So you think, ah, boy, it's 6 point something. That's a lot more. Rather than had they stated it reference to a dipole where they will only say it's 4 dBd. So they will kind of advertise the dBi. And sometimes they won't even tell you it's dBi. They will just say 4 dB or 6 dB and leave that other part silent. But as a trained amateur radio operator, you wouldn't let that, you wouldn't be duped, because you are familiar with the difference between dBi, which is gain relative to an isotropic antenna, and dBd, which is an antenna's gain relative to a dipole. And here we have it. dBi is equal to dBd plus 2.15. So whatever the dBd is, dBi will always be 2.15 dB greater. All right, just a couple more slides before we take our break. All right, so we need to introduce the concept of front to back ratio. So again, we're sticking with directional antennas. And in this case here, we have, maybe it's a Yagi antenna, or it could be a quad antenna or a Quaggy or some sort of directional antenna. And if this is the antenna and it's a directional antenna, this main lobe here, or frontal lobe, will be emanating a strong signal, whereas towards the back or the rear of the antenna, it will still radiate some, but it'll be a relatively small amount of signal, a tiny bit of signal relative to the main lobe or the front lobe. And the front to back ratio speaks to the directivity, or what direction the antenna is, as opposed to omnidirectional, and the amount of gain, right? So this ratio, this front to back ratio, it actually compares the amount of power that is radiated through the front lobe, that's in this direction here, to the amount that is radiated in the back lobe. So that is called the front to back ratio of the antenna. All right, and the main lobe here is where most of the signal that your radio transceiver is generated, that comes up the feed line that goes to the antenna. And this is the antenna here. When that signal leaves the antenna, for a directional antenna, most of the signals will go in this front lobe here. Maximum field strength, maximum amount of signal from the antenna is in this direction. And we also have a little graph here to show a representation of that, right? Where most of the signal goes in a particular direction with your main lobe, and you have just a little bit that's going to the back here as well. So these are some of the charts to use as amateur radio operators. Okay, so let's just do a couple more slides. So we have been talking about directional antennas, and we have mentioned the Yagi antenna before, but let's take a little deeper dive into this Yagi antenna. The Yagi antenna, it's named after a person, so Yagi, sometimes called the Yagi Uda antenna. And this is what it looks like in the air, right? If an amateur radio operator has this, and you will see it looking like this. And if you're thinking, but wait a minute, this kind of looks like one of those older television type antennas, you will be quite correct. This could very well be a television antenna, and there's a rotor or rotator at the bottom, right? So this is in fact a Yagi antenna. You would probably have been familiar with what a Yagi antenna is. There are still quite a few. If you drive around neighborhoods, you may still see some of these antennas around. All right. Okay. So it's a very common type of antenna in amateur radio because it's fairly easy to construct, and also it gives really good gain, right? So the Yagi antenna itself, you have this what's called the boom, right? That's the main part of the antenna, main structure. And then you have elements like these that are mounted onto the boom. And these elements have names, right? So the main element that your transmission line is connected to, or your feed line is connected to, that's called the driven element. And all of the others are parasitic elements. And the one to the back is called the reflector, and the ones to the front are the directors. And the reflector length tends to be a bit longer than the driven, and the directors tend to be a little shorter. So that's kind of how you could, sometimes when you look at an antenna, you can tell what direction it's pointing to, because the elements towards the front of the antenna tend to be a bit shorter than those to the back or the rear, right? And that's what these bullet points are saying here. You have the driven element, you have these parasitic elements that are the reflector, which is longer than the driven element. You have the directors, which are shorter. And you can have multiple directors. You can have one director, you can have two, you can have 5, you can have 15, 20. Yes, there are antennas with multiple directors as well, right? Depends on the design and construction, and also the distance between the elements are also important to the antenna design, right? So the driven element itself here of any Yagi antenna tends to be a half wavelength antenna, right? So if anyone asks what's the length of the driven element, you use the trusty half wavelength calculation, because this is a half wavelength antenna here if you were to isolate it by itself. You're just adding a boom and you have parasitic elements such as the reflector and several directors. And this antenna is highly directional towards the front, which is what this arrow is showing us here. A little more on the Yagi antennas. So this is again what a Yagi antenna might look like. So again, you have the reflector, you have the driven element, and you have multiple directors, right? This superstructure, this part of it here is called the boom. It supports all of the elements. And you can design an antenna and adjust it to the property that you would like to achieve. So if you want the antenna to, let's say, be a stronger gain or more gain, you can add more directors to make it more directional and give it greater gain. So that's why you will see amateur radio operators using Yagi antennas that have multiple directors, because the more directors there are, the more gain and the more directional the antenna is. So these elements here, if you were to increase the diameter of these elements, in other words, make them thicker or bigger, you can increase what is called the bandwidth. In other words, the frequency to which the SWRs will be low around the center frequency that the element is cut for. If you want a greater bandwidth, what you do is use thicker elements or elements that have a increased, you can increase the boom length as well, right? So all of these things, you can lengthen this boom length here to get more gain. You can add directors. You can also increase the diameter of these elements for greater bandwidth. And when you increase the length of this boom and you adjust the spacing of the elements, you can change or adjust what is called the front to back ratio, right? You can also change or adjust the SWR by doing those adjustments as well. So all of those properties of the Yagi antenna are important as an amateur radio when you're designing them. The length of the boom, the number or quantity of directors, the diameter of these elements, how thick they are really, and when you adjust the length of the boom on the spacing between the elements, you can also optimize and change the gain as well as the front to back ratio of the antenna, as well as affect and adjust the SWR. All right, so I think now this is a good point for us to take a short 2-minute break. Let's probably get up, take a little stretch, have a bathroom break, maybe grab some water, and we'll be back in approximately 2 minutes time. Okay, welcome back. Right, so let's continue. So again, we're talking about the directional type of antenna known as the Yagi and what we can do to design and optimize our antenna to have better gain, increase bandwidth, so we have good SWR across the frequency range that we intend to use it, and good SWR, so we have maximum signal transfer and non-wasting. All right, so like everything else in amateur radio, I have several techniques that we can use to get more out of something. And one of them, I guess, just like in Burger King, you can have a double Whopper, or maybe even a triple. You can stack your burger, right? In amateur radio, guess what? We can stack antennas as well. So we have some Yagis here. Notice we have stacked them, right? We have put one antenna on top of the other on the mast, right? And we are separating them by half wavelength. Half wavelength of what? Half wavelength of the operating frequency that we are using the antenna, or the antenna is cut for, or the antenna is designed for, right? So we stack the antennas. Yes, we do, one on top of the other, right? And that will do a couple of things for us, right? First of all, when we stack them like this and we space them half wavelength, we increase the gain by approximately 3 dB. Yes, that's a fantastic amount of gain, 3 decibel gain by stacking. So it's two antennas. We have not applied any more power from our radio. All we have done is use two antennas, right? So are we getting it by magic? No, it's just the property of the antennas in this way, in this array, will cause it to be more directional, because the lobe itself, and we talk about a lobe, which is the signal that's leaving the antenna, it's narrower, but it's also going to travel in that direction a little further with a greater signal strength, or greater field strength, because it's like the flashlight. We are concentrating it more. Sometimes you may recall that those flashlights, when you turn the head, you can actually concentrate the light even further into a spot or into a dot. That's what stacking of antennas do in the equivalent of the light, the flashlight, right? You're focusing even further. And that's what you do when you stack the antennas. And that's what the exam question here is about. When you stack these two horizontally polarized, so they are horizontally polarized Yagis, and they're stacked vertically, and they're separated by half wavelength, you have a gain that will be increased by approximately 3 dB, and also the main lobe elevation is actually narrowed, right? Exam questions. All right, so sticking with Yagis, so remember we did say that the feed point of an antenna may not be equal to the impedance of the characteristic impedance of your transmission line, which is 50 ohms, as well as your radio frequency output of the radio. It's expecting 50 ohms to match, right? That feed point impedance of the antenna ideally should be 50 ohms, but quite often it is not. As a matter of fact, in Yagi antennas, it tends to be quite a bit less than 50 ohms. But what do we do? Can we do anything? Yes, we can. Remember we said that hams are matchmakers. So that's what we do. We make a match. We create a device that will allow us to introduce the properties that will cause that feed point impedance to increase to 50 ohms. And one technique is to apply what is called a gamma match. So on your screen, we have a diagrammatic representation of what it looks like. And we have an actual picture of a gamma match here. So you have the driven element here, and you have the matching section here. And of course, we have another picture here that shows a smaller antenna that has the gamma match on it. So this is a blow-up of a gamma match, and this is the diagrammatic representation of what the gamma match, if you were to construct it, what it will look like. And this is for a particular frequency here. This is actually a 2-meter gamma match in terms of the dimensions that are listed. But the concepts are the same, no matter what frequency. The construction technique is quite similar. So the reason we have this gamma match, and we'll come to another slide just now to show a different type of match that we can use. But what we are trying to do is to increase the feed point impedance, that impedance at that where you are connecting the transmission line to the antenna. It's not 50 ohms. We need to get it to 50 ohms. And what we do is we construct this gamma match and put the feed line to it and make some adjustments such that this feed point impedance becomes 50 ohms, and therefore you will have a very nice SWR. The antenna will be quite resonant and it'll be very happy and so on, right? So that's what we use the gamma match for. And just for the exam, we also need to note that we do not need to insulate the driven element from the boom when we are using a gamma match construct, right? That's an exam question. No need to insulate the driven element, this main element. In this case here, this is the main element, the driven element. The rest are parasitic elements, right? You have the reflectors and you have directors, but the driven element is what we're talking about. You do not have to insulate it from the boom if you're using the gamma match. Okay, yet another type of match. So again, hams are matchmakers, and we are trying to match our radios, radio frequency, output stages of 50 ohms impedance to the transmission line or the feed line or the coax, for example, that has a characteristic impedance of 50 ohms. We are trying to match all the way to the antenna, but the antenna is not 50 ohms. Wow. Again, just like the gamma match, we could use another construct, another type of construction. It's called the hairpin match, sometimes called the beta match, right? So this is what it looks like here. It's actually using a piece of coaxial cable that is shorted to create that match. So this is what it actually looks like practically an antenna. This is and this is diagrammatically what it looks like, right? So again, this is just another option to match. Again, hams are matchmakers, and we need to match impedances so that our SWR will be low and we have maximum signal transfer and minimal losses due to high SWR along our feed line. So the beta match for the exam, you need to know it's constructed of a shorted transmission line stub placed at the feed point of a Yagi antenna to provide impedance matching. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make this feed point impedance 50 ohms, and we construct the hairpin match or the beta match. And in addition, or instead of a gamma match, we can use a hairpin match. Right, that's it for Yagis. So we dealt with dipole antennas before, right? So on your screen in the middle here, we have a dipole antenna, but we just put this up as a reference because we want to talk about another type of antenna called the inverted V antenna. So just to refresh ourselves, a dipole antenna, you have the feed line here, you have the feed point here, and you have one leg that's quarter wavelength long and the other leg that's quarter wavelength long. And this is a half wave dipole antenna. Of course, we have our feed line that goes back to our transceiver, antenna tuner inside of a shack and so on, right? But the dipole itself is supported by these two masts, right? So it's nicely strung here in a horizontal configuration. But we want to talk now about an antenna type known as the inverted V. On the right hand side, this is what it will look like. Again, we have the feed line, it goes to the feed point of the antenna, and you have the two legs, right? Both of them will have a quarter wavelength in quarter wavelength long, and we will notice that it's supported by one central or single support, as opposed to the dipole where you have the two supports. This is supported by one mast, and then you have these elements that are sloping downwards as opposed to it being horizontal. That's why it's called the inverted V, because you can see this is really an inverted V or an upside down V. So simply called an inverted V antenna, right? All right, we come to another antenna type. It's called the log periodic antenna. Interesting kind of antenna. You can see the construction. We've blown it up here so you can see what it looks like. It has the elements, of course, right? All of these here, but they are in fact in a particular construct. If you notice, it's crisscrossed here as well, the connections, and also notice the lengths of the elements as you go this way, right? That's why it's called a log periodic, because the lengths of the elements vary, as well as the spacings between the elements vary, and that's why we say it's logarithmically, right? It's not linearly, it's logarithmically arranged in terms of the lengths of the elements. Notice it's getting increasingly longer, and so on. And notice the space here is also increasing, right? It's not a constant space, so it's not a linear, it's in fact a logarithmic arrangement in terms of the length of the elements as well as the spacings of the elements. So If we were to compare this to the Yagi antenna, this type of antenna has greater bandwidth. It has lower gain than the Yagi, but the SWR could be lower across a wider range of frequencies. So that's why we say it has a wide bandwidth. That's what we mean by a wide bandwidth. It means that it will operate on a wider range of frequencies with a low or matching a good SWR. That's all it simply means when we say wide bandwidth. The antenna itself is good for a wider range of frequency around the center that it's cut for, right? So exam question. All right, we now come to a type of antenna or a concept of an antenna. It's a very practical antenna, but it's also an important concept. And that concept is called NVIS, N-V-I-S. And NVIS is short for Near Vertical Incidence Sky Wave. So let's spend a few minutes talking about what NVIS is and what we're trying to achieve and why it's important. So you have a couple of different types of designs for NVIS antennas. So you have this one here, you'll notice it's a dipole and it's mounted a certain distance above the ground, and notice it may have some elements in the ground also, right, as reflectors. In this case here, it's mounted similar to the inverted V, right? What we are trying to achieve, and by the way, it's good for particular frequencies. This concept of NVIS is not any and every frequency that you will necessarily be able to use NVIS for. But we won't get too much into that at this stage. At this stage, we just need to know the concept of NVIS and how and where we might mount the antenna under what conditions as well, right? So let's just illustrate how the NVIS concept is used. So on this diagram on your bottom left-hand side of your screen, you're an amateur radio operator, you're on the surface of the earth, and you're trying to communicate with another amateur radio operator on the surface of the earth as well, at a long distance. And that's fine, you use your regular antenna. As we said, hams will bounce our signals, or it will go to the ionosphere, it will reflect, well, really and truly, it will refract and bend down, and it may actually bounce a couple of times as well to get to its destination, right? Long distance, right? So you have the ionosphere layers, D, F, and so on, right? But sometimes, you have the skip zone where, you wouldn't be able to communicate because your signal at that frequency in HF is going and bouncing all the way further on. But sometimes you want to communicate near enough or within short range communication on HF. And what you do is a technique called NVIS. So you create or construct an antenna such that when you transmit through that antenna, the signal that leaves the antenna goes pretty high up, almost vertically up, right, at a very high angle, so that when it hits the ionosphere and the ionosphere bounces it, or it reflects it, or really it refracts the signal, it will drop shorter than it would had the signal gone probably at a low angle of radiation, right? Which is what typical antennas will do. It will have as a matter of fact, as a ham, you're actually trying to create a low angle of radiation for your antenna, because the lower it is, the further your skip signal or your signal will go, and it will skip and go all around the world. You're actually trying to achieve that as a ham. But sometimes you want to communicate close by. Let's say the Caribbean here, Caribbean islands, amongst the Caribbean islands, you want to use that NVIS capability. Let's say between Trinidad and Tobago, for instance, you want to communicate short range, whereas normally that signal will bounce all around the world. So NVIS allows that signal to go up into the ionosphere and come back down relatively short, or within what is called the skip distance, right, or the region where often there's no signal that's going, and we actually want to communicate in that region there, that skip zone. And notice we have different ways of constructing the antenna, but for the exam we need to know that the antenna itself is mounted pretty close to the ground. So this antenna here, for example, is mounted at a height somewhere between 1/10 to quarter wavelength above the ground, and that is what the exam question they will ask you about. So that's where you need to learn this. And again, the tip is, most of the time, not all of the time, we have something in yellow. It's directly from the exam. Again, these days, these slides, we have many more things that are in yellow for highlighting purposes, but quite often, once you see something in yellow, there's a good chance that it's an exam question, right? So this is how the NVIS antenna works. High angle of radiation, and it's caused by you have good ground reflection. That's what you're depending on, and it goes high up as opposed to a low angle of radiation. It goes straight out. It goes straight up almost like a rocket, and it refracts down and drops short or shorter as it transfers through the ionosphere, and it comes back down here to Earth, right? NVIS, near vertical incidence sky wave. So another type of antenna that's actually a reception or receive only antenna, it's called the beverage antenna. Now it's not used for transmitting, but it's used for receiving, and it's a pretty directional antenna as well. So this is what it might actually look like. Right? You have the ground and you have your antenna that's strung along this way. This is the beverage antenna, and then of course you have your feed line that's going to your radio in your radio room. Right, so this is just to give you an idea, make it real, what the beverage antenna might look like. This is it right here, the wire that is strung along, right, for some distance, beverage antenna. And it's directional, and it's primarily used to receive MF or medium frequency and HF, high frequency part of the band. So this is an exam question. Beverage antenna, directional, used for receiving, and for MF and the low HF part of the bands. Yeah. All right. So we have some extra information. I don't believe this is on the exam at all, but we have what a quad is, so you can read that on your own. We did cover quads previously, I believe, in the technician class. So just a slide for extra information here, what a quad is, a directional antenna. Another type of antenna is called the horizontal loop. This is also not on your exam either, but extra information that you can read on your own time. Right, so we now come to multi-band antennas. You can have an antenna that can operate on multiple bands. A good example is on your screen here. It's called the ZS6BKW, and that's, by the way, a call sign of someone. And he designed this antenna that can operate and be resonant on 40 meters, 20 meters, 17, 15, 16, even 6, right? It will be resonant even without a tuner. But there's a bit of a disadvantage of these multi-band antennas, and that is that they have what is called poor harmonic rejection. So you may recall that when you transmit, you have the fundamental frequency that is being produced by the oscillators. Your radio is producing and transmitting that frequency, and the antennas will dutifully do that. But quite often, you have these unwanted signals that are called harmonics, and they're really multiples of the fundamental frequencies. So you have the fundamental frequency, but you'll have the second harmonic, the third harmonic, the fourth harmonic, fifth harmonic, and so on. And these can be problematic. So these multi-band antennas actually can encourage or generate these unwanted signals as well. So you need to be aware of that as a ham, that one of the disadvantages of any multi-band antenna could be poor harmonic rejection. These harmonics, as we call them, present and could be problematic for us. It may cause us to cause interference or other issues that they can cause, right? Okay, so we now at the concept of what is a trap, and we'll talk about different types of trap antennas. So a trap essentially is a tuned circuit. So if we look here, we have a coil and a capacitor. Where did we see that before? Right, tuned circuits is an LC circuit, right? So let's think of a trap as a tuned circuit like this, or an LC circuit. That's how it's constructed. And on the right hand side here, we have actually what a trap might look like in terms of a design, right? So notice the coil, and notice this here, which creates capacitance, right? So this is the example of a trap, and this vertical antenna has multiple traps that are installed along the length of the antenna. And the reason why we have these traps, which are essentially tuned circuits installed here, is to allow these antennas to operate on multiple bands, because at a particular frequency, this trap here will cause the antenna to appear to be shorter electrically than it actually is because of the nature of the resonance, right? So it uses these traps conveniently to make the antenna look shorter without you having to go and take off the length, the piece, and put it back on. The electronics will do it for you because the signal and based on the resonance will cause this antenna, let's say for this frequency here, the frequency will think this is the antenna, this section here, that's all the antenna is. This part here doesn't exist. And for another frequency, this trap will cause it, the frequency to believe that this alone is the antenna and the rest doesn't exist, and so on. That's what the trap does inside, or when you put them onto antenna elements. It can also go onto Yagis as well, quite popular. So you'll have a multi-band Yagi. You'll just see those 3 elements and you say, but wait a minute, how is it operating on 4 and 5 different frequency bands? It probably is because you have these traps that will allow this length of aluminum to appear shorter when a particular frequency is being transmitted. It looks to the frequency that this part of the antenna does not exist. Right, so that's a bit of information here on the exam question. Okay, so on the left-hand side, we have our trusty half-wave dipole, which we are familiar with. You know, we have the feed line, we have the feed point, and then we have the 2 elements here, right, which are each quarter wavelength long. So we know about the dipole, the regular dipole. But there's another type of antenna called a end-fed half-wave antenna, right? So it's similar to the dipole in terms of the length, but where it's fed, it's not fed at the center. Remember we were talking about before, we said, you know, when you move the feed point along the half-wave dipole, you increase the impedance. Well, guess what? The extreme version of that is that you move the feed point all the way to one end. So it becomes a half-wave or an end-fed antenna like this, end-fed half-wave, sometimes called a ZEP, right? So this is what it looks like, and for the exam, we need to know, because we have moved the feed point from the center point here all the way down to the extreme end, it has a very, very, very high impedance, and therefore you will need to match it probably using a matching network or some sort of balun, or maybe an antenna tuner in your shack, because the impedance here is very high. It's going to be much higher than 50. Much higher. Exam questions. All right, so just a couple more types of antennas, and then we'll complete our theory and we'll go straight into our question pool review. So we have our antenna that's called a magnetic loop. So this is what it looks like. This is how it's constructed. You have these 2 loops here, and you have this relatively large coil, and then you have this smaller coil here as well, right? So you have a capacitor, and you have the coil, and you have this smaller coil here, and you have your feed line. Right, for the exam, we need to know a couple of things, right? And one of the main things that we will need to be aware of is the radiation pattern. So we have it here diagrammatically, but let's show it on this particular view here. So this is our loop antenna, and the radiation pattern is such that it is maximum in these directions here, right? That's what you call the plane of the loop. But broadside to the antenna, that's this direction here, it's what you call a null, or the signal is very low. It doesn't transmit much signal in this direction. So that's one of the properties that makes a magnetic loop directional. It's very strong. It transmits very strongly in these 2 directions here, or these general directions, and will receive very strongly as well. But in this direction, very weak signals going out, and it will receive signals very weakly as well. So that's the magnetic loop antenna. The radiation pattern is maximum in the plane of the loop, but broadside, they are what you call nulls, or low signals. And that's actually an advantage in a way. You could use it for direction finding, and you can also use it to reduce interference. If you're getting interference from a particular direction, you can use this magnetic loop and essentially ignore that source of interference, because you are putting that source of interference against the null of this loop antenna, and that's how you reject that interference. So that's one way you can use a magnetic loop antenna. All right, so a couple more antennas types. We have what is called the screwdriver antenna, and this sometimes tends to be a mobile antenna. You can find these on vehicles, and it's a motorized antenna. You have the coil, and there's a motor that will send the coil up and down, and therefore adjust the inductance, and therefore the impedance of the antenna by moving the coil up and down. Now, when you do that, you are actually making the antenna resonant on a different frequency, right? So this is an example of the screwdriver antenna. And what we have here, the exam question, the screwdriver antenna has a motorized tuning assembly, that's this motor here, that varies the inductance because it's a coil. Coils have inductance. And to adjust the feed point impedance. So when you want to use a different frequency, you move it up and down, and the impedance will be closer to 50 ohms to match the radio frequency transmitter as well as your feed line 50 ohm impedance. All right, last slide before we go to our question pool. All right, so we have the antennas known as the halo antenna. So we have a nice exploded view here of what one actually looks like. Notice your transmission line, and you have the feed point here, and you have this little loop here, and this is called a halo antenna. And we need to know for the exam that the radiation pattern is omnidirectional, right? So it's the azimuth is 360 degrees. And if we look at it here, we will see this is the radiation pattern here of the antenna, right? It's also a polarized antenna as well. So it's horizontally polarized. So here's a diagram if you want to construct one. This is a construction diagram here. And you also have what it actually looks like, right? That copper tube that's bent. And you have the radiation pattern. So folks, that is before I go to the question pool, just a reminder, we will be repeating this. We haven't yet come to the section of the course where this is yet important, but we need for everyone to know that there are two questions that have been withdrawn from the question pool. That's G1C08 and G1C10. They're both related to the symbol rates that are allowed in digital modes. So these two questions are no longer in the exam, right? So we'll continue to repeat that as we go along. So folks, let's now quickly switch across to the question pool review. Yeah, here we go. Right, so we'll just speed through all of these questions. All right, so for those who are following, we are between pages 61 and page 70, 61 to 70 of the No Nonsense General Class License Study Guide. Let's go. Which of the following best describes the radiation pattern of a quarter wave ground plane vertical antenna? So what they're asking us, the radiation pattern of what type of antenna? Quarter wave ground plane vertical antenna. We did say for that quarter wave, it's omnidirectional in azimuth. In other words, 360 degrees all around. Next question. What is the approximate length for a quarter wave monopole antenna cut for 28.5 megahertz? So we did our trusty quarter wave formula calculation, and we ended up with approximately 8 feet. Where should the radial wires of a ground-mounted vertical antenna system be placed? So we showed that it can be either buried a few inches below the ground or on the surface of the ground. Next question. Which of the following is a common way to adjust the feed point impedance of an elevated quarter wave ground plane antenna to be approximately 50 ohms? So what they're asking us there, if you have a quarter wave antenna, how do you make the feed point impedance 50 ohms? So we showed the technique is you slope the radials downward. All right. Next question in question pool. What is a characteristic of a random wire HF antenna connected directly to the transmitter? So we did say that you can have a kind of dangerous condition where RF current may be present in the shack. So that's the answer. Station equipment may carry significant RF current. So that's a potential hazard. Next question. How does antenna gain in dBi compare to gain stated in dBd for the same antenna? So remember, we said that some manufacturers use that as a little trick to trick you, and they'll tell you whatever the antenna gain is in dB, but they'll conveniently leave out and tell you that it's dBi that they're talking about, right? So dBi is 2.15 dB higher, right, than dBd. So watch out for that. What does front to back ratio mean in reference to a Yagi antenna? So it means that the power radiated in the major lobe compared to that in the opposite direction, right? So that's what front to back ratio is. What is meant by the main lobe of a directive antenna? Well, that is the direction of maximum radiated field strength from the antenna. Next question in question pool. What is the approximate length of a driven element of a Yagi antenna? So let's say that again. What are they asking us? Dissected. What is the approximate length of a driven element of a Yagi antenna? So we showed how a Yagi antenna is constructed. We saw that there's a boom, there's a driven element, and then there are several parasitic elements such as the reflector and several directors. But they want to know what is the approximate length of the driven element. So we said that for a Yagi, that driven element is typically a half-wave dipole. So it's half wavelength. What or how do the lengths of a three-element Yagi reflector and director compare to that of the driven element? So we did say that the reflector will be a bit longer and directors are a bit shorter. That's reference to the driven element. Okay, next question in the question pool. What is the primary effect of increasing boom length and adding directors to a Yagi antenna? So let's dissect this question. What are they asking us? The primary effect. So what will happen if we do what? Increase the boom length or we add directors, right? So we're talking about a Yagi here, right? So if we do both or both of them, you increase the boom length and you add directors, what you will do is you will increase the gain of that antenna. Those are the techniques to increase the gain of Yagi antennas. Right, so that's why we study this, right, folks? As amateur radio operators, we say, aha, right, so my next Yagi, I'm going to put more elements and I'm going to increase the boom length. All right, which of the following would increase the bandwidth of a Yagi antenna? So we did say when we were talking about the Yagi antennas that if we were to use larger diameter elements, the bandwidth will increase. Now remember, when we talk about bandwidth in this context, is the range of frequencies that the SWR will be sufficiently low that you could use the antenna. That's what they mean by bandwidth in this context, right? Or at least think of it that way. All right, next question in the question pool. Which of the following can be adjusted to optimize forward gain, front to back ratio, or SWR bandwidth of a Yagi antenna? So we have A, B, and C, and all of them are correct. The physical length of the boom can be adjusted, the number of elements in the boom can be adjusted, and the spacing of each element along the boom can be adjusted. So therefore, all these three are correct. All right, let's continue. In free space, how does the gain of two 3-element horizontally polarized Yagi antennas spaced vertically half wavelength apart typically compare to the gain of a single element Yagi? Right, so we showed a diagram of that stacked Yagi arrangement, and we said that when we stack them together like that, we get a gain of an additional 3 dBs above what the single Yagi would have provided, right? So you add 3 dB onto it. So stacking of Yagis. Okay, what is an advantage of vertically stacking horizontally polarized Yagi antennas? So the other thing that it does, apart from increase the gain, is that it narrows the main lobe in elevation, right? So those are two things that happens when we stack Yagi antennas. And yes, that's a thing, right? Okay, which of the following is a characteristic of using a gamma match with a Yagi antenna? So let's dissect this question a little bit. So we're still talking about Yagi antennas, a directional antenna, right? Has a driven element, it also has a reflector, and it has usually several directors. But they're asking us, what is the characteristic when we use a gamma match for that Yagi antenna? Well, what it allows us to do, it allows us to mount the driven element directly on the boom, and we do not have to insulate it from the boom. So we can rivet it on, we can fix it to the boom if we are using the gamma match or that type of construct to improve the impedance, to increase the impedance. All right. Okie dokie. So, right, here we go. What is a beta or hairpin match. So that's the other type of match that we showed, which uses a piece of coaxial cable. So it's a shorted transmission line stub that's placed at the feed point of a Yagi antenna to provide impedance matching, right? So that's why we do matching, to match the impedance. The hairpin match is used for the Yagi antenna, and it is placed at the feed point because that's what we're trying to do. We are trying to improve the feed point impedance to that of the transmission line and radio, which is 50 ohms. All right, next question in the question pool. What is the common name of a dipole with a single central support? So we showed a diagram of the regular dipole, half-wave dipole, and then we showed where we support it in the center. It's called an inverted V. Which of the following describes a log periodic antenna? So this is where the element length and spacing vary logarithmically along the boom. Which of the following is an advantage of a log periodic antenna? It has a wide bandwidth. Again, when we say wide bandwidth, we can think of it as the SWR will be low for a wider range of frequencies, right? So wide bandwidth. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following antenna types will be most effective as a near vertical incidence skywave or NVIS antenna for short skip communications on 40 meters during the day? So that's a pretty long question. Let's dissect it a little bit. So what are they asking about? Which of the following antenna types? But for what use? For NVIS use, right? So remember we said we need to use the reflective capability of the ground to send the signal straight up into the sky, into the atmosphere, into the ionosphere, so it could refract down at a short distance. Well, we showed the construct where we had a horizontal dipole and the distance between the dipole and the ground was between 1/10 and quarter wavelength of the frequency above the ground. So that's the answer. What is the primary use of a beverage antenna? Well, remember we said the beverage antenna is used for receiving. We said it was directional, and we can use it for both the MF, the medium frequency, as well as the low HF or the low high frequency bands, HF bands. Which of the following is a disadvantage of a multiband antenna? So we did say that multiband antennas can have harmonics or that's undesired or not desired, and the answer is they have poor harmonic rejection. What is the primary function of an antenna trap or antenna traps? So we showed what an antenna trap looked like. It's essentially a little matching network, usually a coil and a capacitor. You could think of it that way. And the reason we put it in is to shorten the length of the antenna depending on the frequency of operation. So part of the antenna will appear not to exist to the radio and to the signal and to the radio frequency transmission. And the reason we do that is to enable multi-band operation on one antenna. So it will look at a different length for the particular band you're on, and when you switch bands, it will look as though the antenna is a different length. So that is done, those traps are put in there to the antenna to enable multi-band operation. What is the feed point impedance of an end-fed half-wave antenna? Let's dissect this question. What are they asking us? What is the feed point impedance of an end-fed half-wave antenna? So remember we had shown where you have the half-wave dipole antenna, and if you shift the feed point either direction towards the end, the impedance goes up. So this is the extreme case. We shift the feed point all the way to the end. So that's what we mean by end-fed half-wave antenna. So of course, if as we shift that feed point towards the ends, the impedance increases. When it goes to all the way to the end, it has increased so high that the feed point impedance is simply very high. It's the highest it could be, right? Okay, next question in question pool. In which direction or directions does an electrically small loop, and that is less than 1/10 wavelength in circumference, have nulls in its radiation pattern? So the type of antenna that we are describing here, where you have a loop and the total length is less than 1/10 of the wavelength in its total circumference of the antenna, and there are nulls on both sides, and of course you have the strengths on the direction of the plane, is called a loop antenna. So Where it has nulls is broadside to the antenna. So it's broadside to the loop is the answer. All right, we're almost there, folks. Last couple of questions. Thanks for sticking the extra time. How does a screwdriver mobile antenna adjust its feed point impedance? So remember we said you have a little motor there and it sends the coil up and down. It does so by varying the base loading inductance. It's a coil that's moving up and down and therefore you're adjusting the inductance. That L, right? Okay. So last question for the evening. In which direction is the maximum radiation from a VHF-UHF halo antenna? So we did say that that type of antenna, the halo antenna, is omnidirectional in the plane of the halo. That's the maximum radiation. So folks, that is essentially the question pool review that matched all of the questions for the theory that we covered this evening. So let's quickly switch back to our slide deck. All right, so we covered pages 61 to 70 of this evening in the No Nonsense General Class License Study Guide. So we have this trusty table, which we hope that you will keep handy. Anytime we talk about MF and HF and VHF and UHF or the 2-meter band or the 20-meter band, you know, please feel free to look at this until this becomes second nature as an amateur radio operator. And it will, once we are operating and using it, this will become, you know, like back of your hand. But for now, if you're not quite familiar, this is a good trusty table. Shows the relationship between wavelength and frequency to always keep in mind. You know, it shows where lower sideband mode is used, where upper sideband mode is used. It even shows us where the FM broadcast band is in relation to the amateur radio spectrum, right? So feel free to keep this at hand and refer to it as often as necessary, because sometimes the theory or the question will talk about the 6-meter band and you scratch your head, what is the 6-meter band again? It wouldn't tell you the frequency, but you might need to know the frequency. So it's between 50 and 54 megahertz. So this chart hopefully you'll find is useful. Okay, again, any questions, feel free to send an email. I think we had a couple of questions. I think I saw in the Q&A, but we'll deal with that. We already are on overtime, so we'll probably deal with that for the next session. This is the number on your screen that you can send WhatsApp questions to. So folks, we do have a WhatsApp channel. We encourage you to join or add this channel because we will be giving reminders of the upcoming sessions, as well as the link, as well as any other information that the instructor will send out from time to time. Really, some of them are in relation to amateur radio, but others will be things like weather, space weather, and different types of topics as well of interest. So we encourage you to consider joining the WhatsApp channel. You can either take a screenshot of it, you can write it down, or when you get the slide pack, you can simply click on it or copy and paste it, right? So our next session will be next Friday, which is the 12th of January, 2024, usual start time, 8:30 p.m. So thank you, everyone. Do have a good night, be safe, and hopefully see you in next session.